it's Rachel here. I'm sorry for the huge delay between my last video and this video. Lockdown has been busier than I had anticipated, and I had lots of technical issues, but I'm hoping to continue with this project. I think it's really valuable. So in my first video I was talking about dealing with focus, pausing, the power of doing nothing as a performer, and the ability to do that and to recognize your habits and the protective mechanisms you fall back into in order to deal with that fight or flight response that we have sometimes as performers when people are watching us. So I think the natural progression from that for me is to talk about pauses. So pauses are stops that we make in our performance. And today I'm going to be specifically talking about pauses in speech. So the pauses that we use when we're speaking, when we're performing, when we're reciting. And I have thought about it. I've done a bit of research, and I think I would categorize pauses into 4 distinct categories. And those are breath pauses, sense pauses, dramatic pauses, and poetic pauses, are pauses that we specifically use in verse. So that could be in poetry, in, for example, Shakespeare, rap, lyrics, anything that has a distinct rhythm. So today I'm just going to go through the names of the pauses, and I hope to come back to each one and sort of talk about it more in depth. Let's begin with a breath pause. A breath pause, very simply, is a pause that we use to take a breath. It's really important to breathe when you're performing because you want to be able to sustain your voice. And when you don't take a breath pause, what ends up happening is you end up doing this kind of thing where you drop at the bottom of your line because you've run out of breath to sustain your voice. So you want to take regular breath pauses and be able to sustain your voice strongly towards the end of each line and each sentence and each part of what you are performing. So the breath pause is usually signaled by a full stop. So if you're a performer and you are looking at a piece of text and you see that there's a full stop, that is your indication or your permission almost to take a breath. A lot of people don't know that a full stop is literally supposed to be a 3-second pause, which if you time it is quite long. So a nice exercise to do is to take a piece of poetry or verse or a piece of text from a play and actually take those 3 seconds every time there's a full stop to breathe. Take a deep breath. You're performing. You need a lot of oxygen to get to the end of the line powerfully and strongly. And we'll go into breathing again another time. And we want to be using our lungs properly, and we want to be taking a lot of oxygen in so our voices are powerful and sustained. So that's your breath pause. The next pause I'm going to talk about is a sense pause. So I always say to my students, a sense pause is a separation between little packets of information. So when you introduce an image and you're going to move on to another image, you'll take a little pause to let the audience take in the first bit and be ready for the next part. It's to separate them, to let the audience know we were just talking about one thing and now we're talking about a slightly different thing. So you're allowing the audience to absorb the information, to absorb the imagery, to absorb the color of your writing, your performance, the color in the text, and the little packets of information. and they can be very small. So a sense pause is also indicated with punctuation, usually a comma, sometimes a full stop, and it just lets us know that we're going from one thing to the next. And that's it's a complete pause. It's a stop, a complete pause, a complete stop before we move on to the next thing. Then we move on to dramatic pauses. So there is actually a number of dramatic pauses that we use. We have a rhetorical, oratorical, and an emotional pause. And they are all dramatic pauses, or pauses that we use to bring drama and emotion and colour to our performance. So rhetorical pause is a complete stop. It is usually used to make the audience ask a question, or to anticipate what's going to follow, what's going to come next. Then an oratorical pause is usually placed after a word to make the audience reflect on what was just said before. So in the rhetorical pause, we're using it to make the audience think about what is going to come next and see whether it's going to be validated or not. So like if you think of, say, someone says a word like mother, and you're thinking, okay, mother, like what does that bring up for me? What images come to mind? And the performer gives a little pause for you to think about that. And then you have the anticipation of, are my images, my thoughts, my associations with mother going to be validated in this piece or challenged? So it gives us a little something to think about before the next thing. With the oratorical pause, it's placed after the word so we can reflect back on what was just said. So the audience is doing the opposite. And that's a complete stop as well. Then an emotional pause can be a complete stop or an incomplete one. And an emotional pause is usually used to show a disturbed or anguished state of mind, whether that be extreme distress, excitement, happiness, or anger. So those emotional pauses, I think actually emotional pauses are probably the most fun to play with as a performer, because you can put pauses in unexpected places and see how that changes how the piece comes out, or how it changes how we perceive the emotional state of the character or the performer. So then we come along to our pauses that are specifically used in verse or in poetry. So we have what's called a verse pause, which is pretty straightforward. It's a complete stop which separates one verse from the next verse. So usually in poetry or in verse, the verse deals with a particular thought or image or idea, and then the next verse moves on from that and it's something new. So it's kind of similar to a sense pause in that it's separating a little packet from another little packet, but just on a larger scale. Then we have a suspensory pause, or a suspensive pause. Try and say that 5 times fast. And that's a partial pause. So it's not a complete stop. The sense flows on, and I don't know if many of you've heard of the phrase enjambment, but a lot of the time in verse, the line runs on to the next line. So what I find a lot of people do when they start reading poetry is they stop at the end of each line, because they're trying to preserve the rhythm of the piece. But actually, enjambment, if there's no comma and no full stop at the end of the line, you need to run on. The line runs on to the next one. You just go straight into it and you don't stop. In a line of Wordsworth, for example. So we have the line, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills. And what a lot of people will do is they'll stop at the end of that first line and go, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. And you can see how boring that becomes, because they're not respecting when you perform it that way, you're not respecting the enjambment. There's no comma, there's no full stop there, so you run on. And so in poems where there is no punctuation, that can be a bit of an issue for a performer, or it could be exciting for a performer to find where they would put in those pauses and stops. So that's your suspensory pause. And usually at the end of a line, we have a little kind of upward glide in our voice. So we kind of hang on that last word. So I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats so high. So we're going slightly up at the end of the line and going on to the next one. Then we have what's called a metrical pause. So the metrical pause is usually partial. It's a partial pause, and it's used to preserve the rhyming scheme of something. So when you have a very strict rhyming scheme, you will often have sort of shorter lines followed by a longer line. And what the metrical pause does is it allows us to have a stop to preserve a beat that allows us to kind of overall preserve the structure of the piece, and so that the overall duration of each line becomes the same. So if the first line is shorter, we're going to put in a little pause there to draw it out so that it matches the rhythm of the next line. And a lot of the time as humans, we do this without even thinking about it. It comes really naturally to us. But it's interesting to look at places where we do that, where we find those little metrical pauses that preserve the rhyming scheme. So the caesarial pause then is literally a cutting, because caesura is literally a scissors in Latin or Italian. So the caesarial pause is a cut somewhere within a line, and it's usually after the main emphatic word. So an emphatic word is literally the word that we are trying to stress the most in the phrase or in the line that we are dealing with. So when we emphasize, we might put a little pause just to let that sink in or show the importance of the word that came before. So that's the caesarial pause. So just to go back over that again. So we have 4 main categories: breath, sense, dramatic, and poetic pauses. We have breath pauses to take a breath, a sense pause to allow the audience to absorb information. Our dramatic pauses then are rhetorical, making the audience ask a question. Oratorical, placed after a word to make the audience reflect on what came before. An emotional pause to show the emotional anguish of the character or the performer. Then we have in our poetry and verse pauses, the verse pause, which separates verses. We have the suspensory pause, which allows us to linger on the final word of the unstopped line, and it allows us to deal with enjambment where the line flows on to the next one. We have metrical pauses that allow us to preserve the rhythm of a piece, and the caesarial pause, which cuts in somewhere and could be surprising and highlights the emphatic word or phrase, the place where we are putting the stress. So I'm going to go over these again and deal with them one by one, and hopefully give examples of where you can find them in poetry or in text. Let me know what was helpful in here. What had you heard of? What had you never heard of before? Are there any pauses that you find have become a crutch that you rely on a bit too much? Are there ones that you are more aware of now that you will think about in your next piece, of writing, in your next piece of performance? Let me know. Hit subscribe so that you can be updated when I upload a new video, which hopefully will be soon. And let me know if there's something you would like to see next. I'd be really interested to know. Or if you would like me to deal with any of these pauses first before the others, or if there's any that you're not sure that you understand, let me know and I'll deal with those first. So see you next time.